Something that surprised me is how many people consider Space Invaders a horror game. I've seen it cited in books, horror wikis, and countdowns as an early horror game, so I looked into the game I barely knew. I remembered alien horror had been a thing for at least decades by this point. But then I found out it was originally planned to be called Space Monsters, which is about as stereotypical as 20th century horror gets, and wow, I never noticed its official cover monster, or its revered horror soundtrack. So now I'm interested to dive into one of the most iconic horror games in world history. So this Tomohiro Nishikado was interested in working development with his engineering skills, which is why he quit his job at TACT, which had him feeling unfulfilled, and joined Taito Corporation in 1968, developing various arcade games from 1970's Skyfighter to 73's Davis Cup, and his favorite project, 1974's Speed Race. The same year, Ramtech released Clean Sweep, landing as the third best-selling arcade video game of the year just behind Atari's Grand Track 10, which was a successful clone of 1969's Speedway. Atari, of course, was founded and made a name for itself cloning well-received games. And just as Pong was a successful clone of Magnavox Table Tennis, Atari's suspiciously identical game to Clean Sweep would dwarf the original's notoriety, and Tomohiro would get deeply into it. Now in 1972, he dissected Pong's hardware to clone it as Elapong for Taito, but this time he was reverse engineering the aspects of gameplay that made Breakout so satisfying to push the concept forward. His idea was a cover shooter. While Breakout consisted of rectangles, Tomohiro was going for more detailed graphics, considering various things from tanks with rotating cannons to combat planes physically turning in the sky to be what the approaching waves would be. But the difficulty of implementing so much animation on such a mass scale proved the challenge. He then saw a magazine article about Star Wars and realized space, and thought of the Martians in H.G. Wells' 1898 novel War of the Worlds, trying to stick to a theme of octopus-like aliens descending like spiders that don't need to be animated as turning when changing direction. He also ran into the famous blessing in disguise, where the sheer amount of animating enemies on screen would slow the game down, but the player defeating more and more sped the game up, meaning the difficulty scaled with how well the player was doing. So, he decided to leave it in. Sometimes attributed as the first game with difficulty scaling, but I wouldn't be too confident about that. A mirror would be used to reflect a CRT to achieve a crater-filled rock and stars behind the animating enemies, making the game's setting. It's sometimes thought to be inspired by the destroyed Earth that was bombarded by meteorites in the show's space battleship Yamato. It used orange and green strips overlaid on portions of the screen to add further color, as it was not using a color CRT. The game's soundtrack is revered for evoking tension and being one of the earliest known examples of dynamic music. Speeding up when less enemies are on screen is often compared to a heartbeat, much like the increasing speed in the Jaws movie soundtrack. Tomohiro said it took him about 9 or 10 months to make the game overall. He decided to name it Space Monsters, but possibly due to already having a game called Space Monsters, they told him they had to go with another name. So Space Invaders was born. Though Tomohiro suspects the cover monster looking as it does could be a result of the artist being given the name Space Monsters initially, and not actually looking at the game itself. Phillips would, however, release a Space Invaders clone called Space Monster for the Odyssey 2 about 2 years after Space Invaders' launch in 1978. This makes me suspect that Space Monsters did not release outside of Japan, because I'd assume they'd have some sort of trademark for the name in the countries they release. Tomohiro's bosses reportedly feared Space Invaders' reception due to a game over possibly resulting in a shorter playtime compared to a timer-based approach. And yet, it would become so popular that Space Invaders only arcades began opening, as it became the arcade game industry's all-time best-selling, and cited as the start of the golden age of arcade video games. It popularized things like having a high score list, and that move away from timer-based games in general. In the next 2 years, it would become the earliest known horror game to win a Game of the Year award, because it released delayed from Japan to America where it won the award. Its home console version by Richard Marr broke sales records with over 2 million cartridges sold in the first year after being licensed by Atari, quadrupling their console sales. And it is the earliest known horror esport. Video game competitions predate Pong, with the earliest known tournament being held by Rolling Stones magazine in October of 1972 for the grand prize of a year's subscription to the magazine. Throughout the 70s, they'd grow to nationwide tournaments like Sega's 1974 National Championship, and Gremlin challenging anyone to try to beat their pro players Lynn Reed and Sabrina Osman, who tour across the US to accept games of Hustle for $119.77 US. That ain't $100 today. Space Invaders was giant. It had strategy guides on sale. And it would have an appropriate-sized tournament to test its players' mastery. The 1980 Space Invaders Championship to promote its console release would draw in over 10,000 players from across the country, with prizes ranging from a desktop computer to the grand prize of some sort of arcade machine. I've seen it cited as an asteroids cocktail table, but the victor referred to it as a stand-up cabinet in an interview, and would be offered jobs in games journalism following the victory. Space Invaders' popularity is quite something. Apart from the famous corporate gift given at a Coke event turning the monsters into the Pepsi letters, the monsters are often used as logos and even the symbol for video games as a whole. Its soundtrack has been covered by many music groups, but like anything this popular, it was not without its detesters. United Kingdom politician Baron Folks of Cumnock moved to allow the restriction of the video game for its addictive properties through the Control of Space Invaders and Other Electronic Games Bill. It would seem the medical condition referred to as Space Invaders elbow was not the only side effect of the game. Parents from US to Japan had attempted to get legal legislation passed to restrict Space Invaders on the grounds that its addicting nature caused truancy. But their fate would be like Lord Folks of Cumnock's bill, which was defeated 114 votes to 94, which is way too close for my comfort. Of course, with the game's popularity, even in the 70s, they would think about annualizing games, and Tomohiro would get to work on the sequel for the following year's release. Working with the same technology of the first, but now with a color monitor. Space Invaders Part 2 would add much vibrancy to the iconic monsters, though the US release would stick to using color overlays instead. Set in a more fleshed out surface space, you now have to worry about monsters splitting in two, like worms, into what became known as shapeshifters. The new blinking saucers would become iconic of this game, sometimes bringing reinforcements. To help keep track of everything, your cover will now display the current wave number, and the game would incorporate cutscenes, expand on a glitch in the first game causing a trail behind the enemy, now being incorporated as a bonus reward, and improving the bragging rights of high scores by allowing the players to enter their name. While dwarfed by coming out only a year after the original, which would continue to be a top sensation for years, Space Invaders Part 2 would make the rounds, leaving a large impact itself. And while competition was quite convenient on cocktail tables that could flip the screen between each player, the same year Midway would release competitive multiplayer tables, where a second player would be atop, as the two compete from either side of the monster invasion. 5 years would pass. In that time, the arcade golden age was over. Atari's dominance was over, and Space Invaders got a third entry in the series. Return of the Invaders would be easily distinguishable from its predecessors at a glance, from its speed and monster flight patterns to its more detailed sprites. The player can now equip a variety of weapons to face new enemies, bosses, and mechanics, like shifting cover. The dynamic soundtrack was back, and crisper, though a single track has been criticized as the fatal flaw of this game, since you hear it the most, with it sounding too whimsical, as opposed to the looming dread of its predecessor's original scores. While making improvements and climbing charts, its fatal flaw seems to leave it not as fondly remembered as the fourth game. 4 years later, the fourth console generation had people saying super a lot more thanks to Nintendo, and Space Invaders was no exception. Majestic 12, the Space Invaders Part 4, more commonly known as Super Space Invaders 91, would be released in arcades and many home systems, with the arcade version understandably not having the long cutscenes telling the story of how in the year 2061 a garbage dump in space was opened, and a passing cruiser dislodged an original 70s Space Invader cabinet that would float through space for years, before being found by an advanced civilization that decided to recreate the game's enemies in real life, and use them to wipe out humanity across the galaxy. My favorite thing about this game is how it describes Nishikado's original game caused people to steal money, skip work, and even ruin their marriages to play it. I suspect it did the same to this advanced civilization, causing them to seek revenge. The tone carries to the game. Probably most remembered about this game is the missions protecting cows from being abducted by saucers. But overall, this game was a leap on all fronts, with a variety of locations and adversity to overcome, to a soundtrack that did not repeat the mistake of the third entry. While the game would be ported to the Sega Master System, the Mega Drive version would drop the Super from its title and be a completely different game on its own, with an upbeat soundtrack and generally faster pacing, though it still had some relaxing slower paced levels. Now, I know what you're thinking. This has been too scary. Your heart is beating out of your chest. So let's take a breather for a second. Space Invaders 95, The Attack of the Lunar Loonies, lets you play as a toilet, dog in a trash can, or other colorful characters as you fly through vibrant and visually captivating worlds. This might be my favorite Space Invaders game. It's so fun and visually appealing. It's the exact opposite of how I feel about the next one. And I know a lot of people like this game, but Space Invaders, released in 1999, presents the classic Space Invaders gameplay with powerful new weapons through the lens of an action hero, wiping out the invaders in an art direction abandoning them being giant organic monsters to instead all be ships. I assume this was to make them consist of flat shapes with little curves so that they could be done in polygons easier. Despite its contemporary soundtrack, it only really goes for the original's formation pattern, with bosses being the only real deviation from this. It's the opposite of what I'd want in a sequel to Space Invaders, being to move the gameplay forward. It feels like it reverted the improvements that the previous sequels did. Though I guess this would be more akin to a reboot where you go back to basics. It just went a little too far back to basics for me. And its choice of going for ships instead of organic monsters is just far less interesting from a settings perspective for me. But I don't think it's a bad game, especially as you get further into it. Spoilers on that. I did appreciate the humorous battles with the cutouts of the original cover monster and classic sprites, including the recreation of the original game's setting, referred to as the alien's homeworld. It's a little goofy like Attack of the Luna Loonies, and I probably would have liked it if the whole game was like this. The Game Boy Color version would be barely recognizable as the same game, but not do anything to stand out on its own against any other Space Invaders either. These are games that gave me a bad first impression, but I could see myself getting more and more into them as I play them more and more. They definitely haven't scared me away. They just didn't impress me as much as the other sequels.
I think we've been chosen.
Are you ready?
In terms of actually making a sequel, they would return to a different perspective. In 1995, Taito released an Ultraman game that played like a behind-the-back version of Space Invaders. In 2002, Space Invaders Invasion Day would do the same, contextualizing the gameplay as a lone survivor on Earth trying to survive the invasion, featuring new and classic monsters, including the original cover monster, the iconic crab. The face of Space Invaders and sometimes video games as a whole gets such a glow up in this game. And I love seeing the scale of it to a normal person, because you're normally in a big machine. I never really thought about the scale of these giant monsters before now. Invasion Day may answer every gripe I had with the 1999 remake, but it introduced a new one that ruined the gameplay for me. So many enemies taking multiple hits removes the impact of a shooter for me. It's something I don't mind reserved for bosses, but a lot of the impact of what made the original Space Invaders work for me is you're both out in one hit. This is removed by giving either of us health bars. I would call this my fatal flaw that sours my taste, much like that song does for so many in the third game. This game's music is also not the dynamic, slow dread revered about the series, but matches what the game is going for in telling a dire story about being overwhelmed by the sheer scale of adversity that at times seems hopeless. It never felt impactful though, which could have been greatly aided by a more restrained dynamic score like its predecessors. The overall sound design truly lacked impact for a variety of reasons. But other than that, I find a lot of things I like about this game. It's a very specific vibe of game I could only describe as Michigan Report from Hell.
Oh my god!
Don't expect anything too crazy, it's a 12+ game, but I don't know how to describe it other than that. But I've come to appreciate this very specific vibe.
Huh? Wake up! Ah! The corpses are moving! Please forgive me.
It clears the admittedly low bar of being the most interesting visuals and story direction I've seen in Space Invaders, ignoring the apples to oranges of comparing it to Space Invaders 95. I honestly found its 3 characters interesting, with 2 looking to avenge their fallen loved ones, and the 3rd seemingly going mad in desperation from the fact that she never found her significant other in the chaos of the invasion. Whenever the game's tone took breaks from the action-y or tongue-in-cheek, it would always return to the direness of the situation, which it did a good job of conveying through gameplay. But that single decision to make health bars ruined that gameplay for me. Its story is also a single event in an unresolved invasion which never got a sequel, likely to this one's negative reception. And this is the last time they would ever try to make a big sequel to Space Invaders. But far from the last time they'd use the IP for games. After a few years, Space Invaders Evolution would have a quite unambitious by comparison rhythm game that I'd call even simpler than the original, with one row of enemies that don't change speed and are simply fodder to build yourself up to enjoy defeating the background saucers. This was packaged as an extra new Space Invaders in a UMD collection that also featured a very visually incomplete original, and an old school Versus that treats your PSP like a cocktail table. Having a new game in a collection like this is probably what I would have wanted the 1999 game to be, if it wasn't made into a proper sequel. Celebrating the retro of 70s Space Invader is what the IP would be from now on. Evolution was in line with Space Invaders Revolution that same year, having you globetrot to play 70s style Space Invaders game with modern sound design. When the 30th anniversary arrived, they'd release a plethora of games to celebrate. Space Invaders Extreme added many visual effects and challenges to the 70s era Space Invaders gameplay, even receiving a sequel the following year. Space Invaders Beat Attack would have you play 70s style Space Invaders with your feet. Space Invaders Get Even would have you play as the Invaders, returning after being defeated in the original game. You pilot the saucer, trying to destroy the Earth by dropping sprites on the monsters.
Commander, what in blazes is that? Those are the Space Invaders. We broke them off 30 years ago.
Get Even is my favorite of the 30th anniversary games, but most surprising to me is Space Invaders World War, which is an MMO Space Invaders game, where you fire at random sprites approaching, with both you and them seemingly having no movement restrictions from the footage I found. But it was shut down a little over a year after launch. I was expecting it to look more like the 40th anniversary game, Gigamax, where you simply have multiple players on screen, but this does seem VR port friendly. Like Space Invaders 4 stated, as time moved on, people found new forms of entertainment, and while Taito couldn't keep Space Invaders up with the Joneses, going this direction of only celebrating retro nostalgia for the first is a reminder of just how impactful it was. In the 21st century, Tomohiro Nishikado was asked what he thought of Atari co-founder Nolan Bushnell, saying he didn't like modern video games. Nishikado answered that AAA games usually being created by such large teams can make the creators of their era feel disconnected, and AAA games of the 21st century often put more concentration on the graphics than the depth of the game's mechanics, which makes him sad too. He stated that Galaxian is more what he was trying to make with the original Space Invaders, but falling short of that is the reason it succeeded, so he wouldn't have any desire to go back and change how his game came out. I'm Oak Taro.